Hi, Bill here. I'd like to look at some opening traps. Okay, first one. White plays the Polish opening. Black gets a pawn in the centre. White attacks the pawn. Now the next move is not so good. Knight defending the pawn. Knights are not the greatest defences. White chases the knight away. There's only one move for Black to avoid losing a pawn. That's knight to d4. But now e3 attacks the knight and the bishop defends a pawn. So White will win a pawn in this position after the knight moves. So say the knight moves, back, bishop takes pawn. Next game. White plays the English opening. It's a symmetrical English. Okay, White's knight comes out, Black's knight comes out. White starts the fianchetto, Black starts the fianchetto. So it's a symmetrical English. Complete the fianchetto, complete the fianchetto. Knight comes out, pawn comes up. So White is setting up the Botvinnik system, and he's fighting for control of d4 at the cost of weakening his d5 square. a3. The idea is to play b4. White moves his knight to... Black moves the knight to e7, so he doesn't block the bishop. Now, White plays a gambit. He offers a pawn. Black accepts the gambit. Bishop comes out, hitting the knight. Knight retreats. Knight to b5, so there's a weak square here. So White's got the knight threatening to bring the knight into a check. So Black castles. Bishop goes to the strong square. So now White's got an eye on the c7 square. Pawn attacks the knight, which is a mistake because now White wins the queen. Bishop attacks queen, queen runs, knight traps the queen. Next game. Another English. d5. Not usual here. Pawn takes pawn. Now if queen takes pawn, White can bring the knight out, hitting the queen and gaining time. Knight to f6. This manoeuvre works in some positions, but not in this one. e4. And now White has won the pawn, has retained the pawn. If the knight takes the pawn, that is a blunder, because White has a fork which will win the undefended knight. Queen check, winning the knight. Next game. d4 this time. b5, the Polish defence. Not very common. e4, White seizes the centre. a6, defending the pawn. c4, attacking the pawn. Bishop attacks the e-pawn. Pawn to f3, defending the e-pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop recaptures with a developing move. Pawn to e6, making the white bishop bite granite. Queen to b3, hitting the bishop. Now Black sets a trap. Knight to c6, threatening knight a5 and swapping off the bishop. And if the greedy queen takes the bishop, the knight moves to a5 and traps the queen. The queen has nowhere to go. So White wins the queen for bishop and rook. Next game. d4, d5. Knight out, blocking the c-pawn, so the most common move would be c4. Knight to f6. e4, the Black Mardima gambit. Pawn takes pawn. Black accepts. f3. Pawn take bishop f5, so Black doesn't take the second pawn. But now Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen f3, hitting the knight and the bishop. Knight takes knight. Now it starts getting tricky. Queen takes bishop. Now black plays a greedy move. Queen takes pawn. Now white sets a trap. He takes the knight. Now black can win the rook, but is it a good idea? Queen takes pawn check, forking king and rook. King moves. Queen takes rook, and now the tables are turned. White has mate in one. Mate. Next game. Queen pawn. Opening. Queen's gambit. Queen's gambit accepted. E3. The safest way to win the pawn back. B5. Defending the pawn. A4. Undermining the defence of the pawn. C6. Defending the B pawn. Now white swaps pawns. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now at the beginning of the game, the rooks are undefended, and this diagonal is weak, and white can win material by attacking down the diagonal. Queen to f3, and there's no safe way for black to block and save the rook. So white wins material. Next game. Queen pawn. Queen's gambit. Queen's gambit accepted. The main line. King's knight out. King's knight out. E3. Hitting the pawn. A6. Getting ready to expand on the queen side with B5. White regains the pawn. Now black pins. Not a good idea in this position, as white has a tactic. He sacrifices on f7, drawing the king into a knight fork. The king moves and white regains the bishop, and white has won a pawn in the process and weakened the black king. Next game. Another queen pawn game. Queen's gambit. The Alban counter gambit. White plays pawn takes pawn.